Hello and welcome to the webinar on providing habitat for wild bees on organic farms. This is your host, Alice Formiga of the eOrganic Community of Practice at extension.org. You can find all of our articles, videos, and recorded webinars on our website and also on the eOrganic YouTube channel. The presentation will last about 50 minutes, and then we'll have about 30 minutes for questions. We'll be reading as many questions as we can in the 30 minutes after the presentation is over. So for today's presentation, I'd like to welcome back Elias Bloom and Rachel Olssen, who are PhD students of entomology at Washington State University. We also welcome Bridget McNassar, who is the manager of the Native Plant Nursery at Oxbow Farm and Conservation Center. They are all collaborators on a NIFA OREI funded research project called Promoting Native Bee Health and Pollination Services on Organic Fruit and Vegetable Farms, led by David Crowder of Washington State University. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to our first presenter, who is Elias Bloom.
Thank you, Alice, for the introduction. And briefly, I just want to thank our funding sources, which are on the first slide too, the USDA and the NSF, and then also the Western SARE, so the Western Division of the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program. So I will be talking in this first section here, and then Bridget and Rachel will be starting right after me. And I'm going to start by giving you folks some background on bees and our project, and then I'm going to start to get into how to connect farms with natural areas and redesigning the farm, how you can work to redesign your farm for bees, and then kind of what the future of some of our research on farms looks like. Okay, so the global value of pollination services for bees is relatively unknown, specifically for organic farming systems. However, for farming systems worldwide, we do know that the value of pollination for pollinators is worth billions of dollars annually. And so when we're talking about the crops that these pollinators are responsible for pollinating, we're talking about many of the major cropping systems worldwide. And as you can see from this map, not only are honeybees responsible for some of this pollination as seen here in green, wild insects such as wild bees and other types of wild insects that are also pollinators contribute significantly to the pollination of many different crops. It's also important to note that human health relies on these crops, and if we were to not have these crops that rely on pollinators, humans would lack the vital minerals, vitamins, and antioxidants that keep us healthy. So many people think that humans could live without pollinators, and that simply is not the case. And for many of these vital minerals and vitamins and antioxidants, really the only way that humans can get them are through pollinators. Next slide, please. Moreover, it's important not only to have honeybees, or just one pollinator, but it's important to note that we rely on bee communities rather than single populations or single species to achieve these pollination services that we rely on to produce food. So one example that I can show you is that in conventional farming systems, what we typically see is very low diversity of bee species. And as we move to organic farming systems, we see very high diversity of bee species. And as you increase in biodiversity, the number of species that is, and also the evenness or the equal abundance of those species to one another, we see increases in ecosystem services, i.e. pollination. So there's a lot of research that shows that increasing bee biodiversity also increases ecosystem services, and this is due to the partition of floral resources over space and time on a farm. It's important to note that much of the data we have only exists for monocultures, and we are really lacking data on this for polycultures or diversified farming systems. So as you're thinking about your farm and designing your farming system and thinking about pollination with bees, we should definitely be thinking about how to increase bee biodiversity and the evenness or equal abundance of these pollinators on your farm. There has been a considerable amount of research on honeybees more broadly, but there isn't really very much data on the health of honeybees or wild bees on organic farms sort of specifically. And once again, that's particularly true for small-scale diversified farming systems. But we do know that providing extra floral resources, seen here by this positive sign, reducing the use of pesticides, seen here by this negative sign, that's a reduction in the use of pesticides, and through the internalization of externalities, this positive sign down here, we do improve bee community health more generally speaking. And so what we do need is more research to address some of those factors and figure out what's really controlling bee health on small-scale farming systems in particular. Now getting to our research a little bit, we are in the midst of a 5-year investigation of wild bees on diversified farms in Western Washington. This project began in 2014. And it started with a study of urbanization. So what's going on with urbanization and how does that impact bee biodiversity and also their pollination services? And we've been measuring bee biodiversity on not only farms in urban areas, but also on a number of farms that are certified organic and transitioning to organic farming practices as well. And so now we have this baseline of data where we can sort of start to do some of these habitat augmentations and manipulate habitat and forage for bees and see how that influences bee biodiversity and ecosystem services like pollination. And so that's really going to be the focus of the rest of the talk today, is talking about how you can manipulate habitat and forage on organic farms, and then what does that do to bee biodiversity and the ecosystem services they provide. Just to briefly introduce you to where our farming systems are located on and where our data are coming from, here's kind of a map of where the organic acreage is and where the smallholder farms are in Washington State. And as you can see from this map, the mainstay of small-scale organic farming systems are located in the blue counties, and then these white counties have less than 50% small-scale organic farming, which is I classified as less than 30 acres of production. And our farming systems here are outlined in yellow, so these are the farming systems that we're working with. And also you can see here that acreage in organic farming has been steadily going up in Washington State, although this graph is a little out of date. It still has been steadily going up in Washington State, and so have sales in organic products. So researching bees is important for those farming systems because many of those different farming systems rely on pollinators to produce food. And moreover, the small-scale farming systems have been largely ignored by researchers and are often billed as more sustainable than their conventional counterparts. And so we kind of want to investigate what's going on there and what's making the systems more sustainable potentially than other types of farming systems, and how do bees play into that. In addition to where those farms are located, it's also important to note that we're still interested in how the landscape is impacting bees. So not only a variety of different landscape factors, but also urbanization. And once again, here you can see our research sites, and you can see some of them are kind of embedded in agriculture and outside of these gray areas. And these gray areas are development or urbanization. And urbanization has increased dramatically in our study area. And in King County alone, which is this county here in the center, it's increased by 242% since 2007. Much research indicates that urban areas can serve as a source of biodiverse bee communities, which is kind of surprising for maybe a lot of people. And it's important to note that, since urban areas might then act as a source for bee species in the future, if we are to think about conserving bee species more broadly on a landscape level, which I'll be talking a little bit about more. And you know, providing habitat for bees on organic farms is going to be made more challenging by these different landscape factors that are shaping bee communities. And this is even more important to note in that wild bees are becoming increasingly rare or even extinct due to landscape level change, not only due to urbanization, but also due to the increase in large-scale farming systems. And so what you can see on the right here is all these areas in yellow are now predicted to be considerably low in their bee abundance. And then you can also see over here the areas where there's low supply and then high demand for those bee species. And these are also areas where a lot of farming is going on. And so what we do know in North America is, and in Europe mostly, is that we have seen some range contractions of certain bee species and extinction events. But we have seen a stabilization in those declines, and so it's really species specific, and that's what we're starting to learn. But that is hampered by our lack of data, and so studying bees on organic farms and farming systems and across our nation and across the world more broadly is important for the future of producing food on organic farms. So getting down to connecting this to organic farming systems, one way that we can start to provide habitat for bees on farms is through the use of roadsides. And in Washington State, there's approximately 150.48 miles of roads that border organic farms that require pollinators. And these roadsides have not been restored yet, but the restoration of roadsides along organic farming systems, and if they're suitable for restoration, you have to figure out if they're suitable first. But the restoration of these roadsides likely would serve as a source of bee habitat and then increase ecosystem services on those farms. So if you're an organic farmer, you should be thinking about this particular tactic as a way to increase pollination services on your farming system. And in addition to that, there are lots of roads throughout Washington State, as you can see here. And many of those roads are called urban gateways. And so these are areas that are able to connect urban areas to rural areas. And some of these roads are very highly suitable for restoration too. So like I was mentioning before, connecting urban areas with rural areas and thinking about bee conservation and the connectivity of farming systems throughout the landscape could use roadsides to do that. Another area of interest for connecting farms with habitat for bees is the use of power line easements. And there really isn't a lot of evidence for power line easements, and we've been doing, actually one of our collaborators has been doing work with Seattle City Light here in Washington State to restore some of these power line easements and also monitor bee communities within these restored and unrestored areas to see what happens when you start to restore power line easements for bees. And just similar to roads, these restoration projects could very well connect organic farming systems with bee communities that simply cannot be found on their farms yet. And a lot of this is helped along by policy. And so as you're thinking about this, you might say, well, what do I do about that? Well, we have to continue to encourage policy to and state local and national level government to work with us on these types of projects. Now, interestingly, a lot of research, or some research actually, indicates that there are going to be bees that we are simply not going to be able to conserve on farms very easily. And so you might say, oh, I want to put in a habitat strip on my farm, or I want to put in some sort of habitat or forage on my farm, but some bee groups are very difficult to restore on the farm, but they do live in natural lands adjacent to farms. So the conservation of these natural lands is going to be important, because these natural lands can provide bees that can then spill over into farming systems, into organic farms, and provide pollination services. And likely this is going to be, once again, species dependent. And so what we found in some of our research is that the more your farm's embedded in a grassland or pasture type system, the less of these particular groups of cavity nesting bees you will have. And so when you are thinking about growing a crop that might need cavity nesting bees from the megachilidae, then you might want to take into consideration your embeddedness in the larger landscape, such as a grassland or pasture, and that might then inform whether or not you need to actually be providing that type of habitat for those bees. All right, so what can you do on your farm? I'm going to talk, a lot of this is going to be considerably more broad than maybe some of you might like, but fortunately Bridget McNassar is going to talk a lot more about plant biodiversity and how to actually put in habitat strips on your farm. So I'm going to talk about this stuff kind of more broadly and quickly. So what we've been finding is that organic farmers who create and maintain nest substrate for bees, by providing that nest substrate, you do end up having more cavity nesting bees on your farm. So what we've been doing is putting in cavity nesting bee structures like this one down here that have a variety of different diameters that generally provide habitat for bees that are cavity nesting bees, such as bees in the megachilidae. And what we found is that when you have previous management on these farms, you end up having a lot more cavity nesting bees get into these structures. And so that shows a certain amount of promise for building up those bee species in your farming systems. But we've yet to find that by providing those extra habitat, those nesting resources, we've yet to find that actually increases the abundance of bees that we're finding in the field or the pollination services that they're providing. But we're still doing research on this, and I am hopeful that we will start to find some significant results that providing habitat like this actually does increase pollination services. And there's evidence from that outside of our systems. Another thing that you might be thinking about doing on your farm is putting in some type of floral buffer strip. And the research also indicates that by putting in a floral buffer strip like you see here on the left, you will increase the number of native bees visiting your potentially. This was done in blueberries, but what they did was they put in a habitat strip on the margin of the farm, and then after a few years they started to see significantly more native bees visiting their blueberry plants. What we've also found is that broad-scale diversification of your farming system, so growing a lot more different crops, also correlates strongly with the amount of different bee genera or bee groups that you'll find in your farming system. So in farms that have high plant diversity, we found significantly more bees than in farming systems that have low plant diversity. And so that's something that you should be considering, is introducing floral diversity either on the margin of your farm or intentionally within your field by growing a lot of different crops. There's also a good amount of evidence or some evidence that now indicates that providing those plants that are also native is the most effective for wild bee management. And this research comes out of California here and on the left here. And so what they found is that using native plants provides provides resources or increases the number of bees more dramatically than using exotic plants. And so you want to select plants that are native, and that's going to be helpful to getting more bees onto your farm and providing resources for bees. Bridget's going to talk a lot more about that. We've also found that, interestingly, that certified organic farms versus or farms that just practice organic methods have greater bee abundance in our farming system. So there is something about organic farming systems that increases the abundance of bees. And what some of the other research shows is that switching from conventional farming systems to organic farming systems can increase your bee biodiversity by up to 75%. So what's the future of our research look like? We are now working on providing suites of habitat rather than one type of habitat alone to see if we can boost bee communities on organic farms. So we're using ground nesting resources, bee beds are what we call them, floral resources, and then we'll also be putting in some nesting structures on the margins of our farms and urban gardens to look at the response of bees. We're also looking at the economic value of pollination for these small-scale organic farming systems. So we're doing some cage experiments with plant diversity and looking at pollination services. And then also one big way that you can get involved in providing more information to researchers, but also learning a lot more about the bee communities on your farms, is to work with researchers on collecting data on the bee communities that you have on your farm. And so we've been working with citizen scientists in the Seattle area to collect information on bee biodiversity and also cavity nesting bees in that area. So citizen science is somewhat of the future for collecting a lot more data over a broad temporal and spatial range, especially in organic farming systems. And with that, I'll go ahead and let Bridget talk to you a lot more about providing floral resources for bees on organic farms.
Okay, great. Thanks, Eli. This next portion, we're going to talk a little bit about native plants and using them as wild bee habitat. As Alice mentioned earlier, I am the Native Plant and Restoration Manager at Oxbow Farm and Conservation Center, and we're a nonprofit organization located a little bit east of Seattle in Washington State, and we are one of the participating farms in Eli's and Rachel's bee study. Just a quick intro to Oxbow. We are a nonprofit organization, and our mission is to inspire people to eat healthy, sustainably grown food and steward our natural resources for future generations. We use our 200-acre property to kind of answer questions that we think are interesting to other people. We have an organic vegetable farm. We have a kids environmental education program, native plant nursery. We do a lot of restoration and conservation activities on the property, as well as research around those activities, and we engage the public through our volunteer program. The nursery, where we grow our native plants, we really have the general mission of just getting more people out there growing and using native plants. And so to that end, we grow and sell native plants in containers. We have a new research program in which we kind of look at issues and problems that people have with growing natives and try to help out with that. And then we also offer educational services and serve as technical experts. So just to start us off talking about natives, get us all on the same page, kind of the generally accepted definition of a native plant is a plant that existed in an area pre-European settlement. So it's something that's been around for thousands of years in an area. And it's helpful to kind of further define that by looking at the place that something is native to more specifically. So for instance, if I said, this plant is native to the United States, it might not be super helpful to me up in Washington State if it happens to be a plant that mostly exists in Florida. So we kind of further define nativity by regions where something's native from, called ecoregions. And an ecoregion is just an area that has the same general soils and climate and geology, and thus would support the same plants and animals. So using native plants, we talked about this a little bit already, but it's generally desirable because the plants are just, like I said, have been around for thousands of years. They're adapted to the local soils, the local climate, and they can really thrive once planted and established with minimum care. They shouldn't really need to be watered or fertilized or other care taken for them. And as Eli mentioned earlier, we're noticing more and more that native plants appear to be more effective for wild bees, which makes sense because they've co-evolved with them. Both the bees and the plants have lived in an area for thousands of years, and so they're familiar to the bees. They know what to do with them. They know how to get resources from them, and they can be up to 4 times more attractive to bees. Sometimes with some of the more cultivated plants that humans have bred over the years, sometimes when we breed a plant to be more showy and beautiful, sometimes some of the traits that would be helpful to bees, like producing nectar and pollen, get lost. So there's a chance with that with more cultivated plants. So if you're thinking of installing habitat for bees using native plants, kind of your first step is to look and find what plant is appropriate for your region. And it doesn't have to be plants that would necessarily exist right on your specific site. For example, Oxbow is located in a river floodplain. If our farm wasn't there, the property would probably be covered with, large deciduous trees and shrubs. But we don't want to plant that for our native habitat strips because we're a farm, and we kind of now have this big open space. So what I would do is I would just look. I'm located in this Puget Sound region, and so I'm going to look for other habitats like a farm habitat, a big wide open space in our area. And we have these Puget Sound prairies, so I might look for plants that exist in that area. The Xerces Society has a really great resource called Pollinator Conservation Resource Center on their website. And what they've done is they've broken down the United States and Canada into 10 different ecoregions. And you can click on your ecoregion. So here's ours right here. And it will give you lists of pollinator plants, native plants for pollinators. It's a great resource, and they also have a lot of other information there that we'll link to later in this talk. Another good one is through the Pollinator Partnership. They have these ecoregional planting guides, and they've divided the United States up even further into 32 regions, and each with its own guide that shows, again, plants that they recommend planting in that area and just some general information about the soils and climate of your region that might help you in making choices of plants. Other organizations that you'll find in your specific areas could also be helpful to you. Each state has a native plant society, and generally they've got great websites with lists of natives for your region. Also, your soil and water conservation districts and your cooperative extension offices. Typically, they have a lot of great online resources, information, as well as sometimes giving workshops about native bees and native plants, and have a lot of technical experts on their staff that could help give you advice in planning your project. So once you've kind of learned more about the plants that are native to your area, you want to make some decisions about the plants to choose for your property. And one big thing to keep in mind is variety. You want a variety of species. And an important part of choosing that variety is the timing of bloom of the flowers. You want there to be some plants blooming from as early in spring as possible to as late in fall as possible. And that will just give continuous floral resources, nectar and pollen, for the bees. And so they'll stick around all season long, and will also hopefully be providing pollination services for all season long. The early bloom time plants can be especially important. There's several species of bees that reproduce or have multiple generations throughout the season. And so if once they emerge in the spring, they have plenty of food, they're more likely to be successful reproducing, and you'll have more bees in those later generations. Besides variety of bloom time, you just kind of want to think of a variety of appearance, I guess. Things that look different about the flowers, their shape, their size, their color, and this will attract a greater diversity of bees. Bees they're different sizes, they have different lengths of tongues, and so they can use and are attracted to different types of flowers. And as Eli mentioned earlier, we get more services from a greater diversity of bees, so trying to obtain greater diversity of bees is helpful. Also, I just want to mention the picture in the middle shows native bunch grasses. Though these don't produce flowers that are useful to bees, they provide overwintering habitat and nest sites for bumblebees down underneath their little bunchy bottoms. So when you're ready, you've kind of decided the species that you want to try to get or install. You want to start looking for where you can buy your plants or seeds. If you're on a farm, it's most likely that the area is large enough that you're going to use seeds. If you're working more in an urban space or raised bed type situation, you could probably install actual plants. As you're looking, you want to find someone as local as possible. These people are experts and can help you make some decisions. The Native Plant Societies, conservation districts, cooperative extension offices, they all have lists of native plant nurseries in the area that can be a resource for you. Again, the Xerces Society in each region has a list of nurseries and seed companies in your area, and they also have this really cool resource where they have developed these conservation seed mixes, and there's 17 different mixes for different regions in the United States and Canada, and they are a mix of native seed developed with a seed company, so that if you live in one of those areas, you can contact that seed company and get that native seed mix that's recommended for your region. If you're not buying one of those pre-made seed mixes or buying plants, you want to ask some questions from the company that you're buying from. You want to make sure that the plants that they're providing are locally sourced. This just gives them a better chance of surviving in your particular area. For example, a species of native plant, yarrow, something that exists really widely across the United States. And if I was going to plant yarrow on my farm, I would want to make sure that the seed didn't come from somewhere like Southern California that's much hotter and drier than it is up in Western Washington, and thus probably wouldn't enjoy our super wet winters. Another tip is just to ask and kind of make sure that you clarify that something's native. A lot of times people will say wildflower mixes, and wildflower is just kind of a general term that means like a plant is native to somewhere. It might not be native to your area, so just kind of ask about that if you see that word. Lastly, I just want to talk about actually getting your seeds or your plants. Get them as early as possible, and you're probably going to be, in most areas of the United States, planting and or seeding in the fall. Especially if you're seeding, fall's the best time to go get your seeds onto the ground. A lot of native species need to be cold for a period before they'll germinate, and so you sow your seeds in the fall, tuck them in for the winter, and they'll come up in the spring when they're ready. But you shouldn't wait until fall to kind of get in contact with seed companies. They might be already sold out by then, or seed might be already spoken for. So maybe in the spring, when you are kind of sowing your seeds on the farm and getting things set up, start talking to growers and seed providers and see if you can pre-order or get your order in before fall time. And then lastly, I just wanted to mention, as far as organic certification goes, most native plants and seed that's available for purchase is not certified organic, so you'll likely have to fill out a commercial availability record for that. And I know if people have questions about that later, Eli went through that process for the native seeds that he's doing for his research project. And we have at the end of the presentation listed some of the resources that I mentioned that you can access in the PowerPoint. And with that, I'll turn it over to Rachel.
Thanks, Bridget. Okay, so Bridget and Eli did a really great job of talking about sort of the ways that you can work on your farms to kind of encourage pollinators. And now I'm going to change directions just a little bit to talk about the specific research that we're currently doing and that we've done to kind of help inform some of that. So our research has a couple of different components. The main one that we have some results for so far is monitoring research. So we're visiting farms and we're monitoring a few different things. We're monitoring floral diversity, so the number of different types of flowers on any given farm, bee biodiversity, so the number of different types of bees, the bee abundance, the total number of bees, and then we're also taking measurements of bee health. So let me just make sure that I've got control here.
Okay.
Perfect.
It works.
So we are doing this research on 35 farms in Western Washington, which I think Eli showed you a map previously. But you can see they kind of range from urban to rural. We've got some of our sites are right within Seattle city limits and around Olympia, which is the capital. And then some of our farms and garden spaces range out into the more rural regions outside of Seattle, up near the Mount Vernon area and down south of Olympia. These farms all vary pretty widely on their floral biodiversity and abundance, and their size varies pretty widely, from less than 1 acre up to around 30 acres. And all of these spaces are either certified organic or practicing organic. As I mentioned, we have this sort of urban to rural gradient, where a rural farm might look more like something you see here on the left, with large patches of the same crop or a similar crop being planted so that it can be more mechanically harvestable, or in general just makes it easier for a grower to manage this one type of plant over a bigger space. Whereas in the more rural area or urban areas, like you see here on the right, these might be things like parks or community gardens, where each individual person is growing a small patch, and so they might have a lot of different things within a small space, or overall, the overall garden space may just only have a few different types of flowers, or rather a few different individuals of a lot of different types of flowers. So these are just a couple of examples of a really rural space versus a really urban space, but as I mentioned, our farms kind of vary pretty widely along that gradient. So we start out by visiting each of these farms and we take a measure of their floral diversity and abundance. So we will walk along a transect of the farms and we will drop what you see here. This tool in the middle is a meter square. We'll drop the meter square and count the flowers, and we'll identify the flowering plants within that meter square. We spend an hour doing that. We keep track of every single flowering plant that is in bloom at the time that we visit. We, I think, each have a little method of tallying to keep track of how many we've got, but we'll do that for an hour. So that sort of allows us to quantify and make a uniform assessment of the floral diversity, even though the space be different in terms of size or overall number of flowers. We can keep track of how many flowers and how many different types of flowers there are in a pretty consistent way for each farm. We also measure the bee diversity abundance, and we do this in a couple of different ways. First off, we just monitor the bees. We walk out along that same transect through the farms, and we observe bees visiting flowers. So as you can see here in the middle, we have a bumblebee visiting a poppy, I think that is there. And then we'll just take note of what types of bees we see on the individual types of flowers. The other way, because some of the bees are a little bit smaller, harder to see, we also catch and we collect bees in a couple of different types of traps, we'll use a bucket trap and then the small pan traps like you see with the little Dixie cups. And then we also use aerial nets to collect bees by hand. So we use all of this whole suite of methods to collect different bees so that we can ensure that we have an accurate representation of the biodiversity of bees on each farm. The other piece that we're collecting is measurements of bee health. And right now, what that looks like is we're taking measurements of bumblebees and honeybees on their body size and their fat content. So the two ways that we're doing that, we're measuring overall body size by measuring the intertegular distance, or the distance between their wings, as you can see here by this sort of red line. And then we're also extracting the fat from the bees, because bees get their nutrition during their larval stage. All of the bees' body and fat content comes from the nutrition that's collected by the foragers in their colony, and so having an access to a greater availability of nutrients, whether it's more abundant nutrients or a more diverse nutrients, may indicate that they end up with a different body size or a different amount of lipid content. So we bring those bees back, we measure them, and we extract the lipids. So we do have some results so far, which I'll go ahead and share with you. The results that we have are the floral diversity, the richness and abundance of flowers at our sites, and the bee diversity, and then we have the body size measurements for the bee health, and we're still working on a couple other things. So to get started, the floral richness, so that's the number of different types of species, or the number of different types of flowers by site type, we see a much higher richness in urban spaces versus rural spaces. Again, that's just a measurement of how many different types of flowers we're seeing. It is not related to the overall number of flowers, which we see on the next slide. The overall abundance of flowers, so completely separate from the number of species, just the individual number of flowering plants, we see a higher number in our rural spaces than our urban spaces, which is kind of what we expected based on, you know, the images that I showed you earlier. The overall diversity of these spaces is measured by, we use the Shannon Diversity Index, which takes into account the floral richness and the floral evenness. So the example that I give is if we have 10 different types of flowers at each space, but at one space we have one of each, and at another space we have 100 of one and one of each of the others, then the space that has one of each type of flower is very even, whereas the space that has a whole bunch of one type and only one of each of the others is very uneven. Urban spaces tend to be overall more diverse, so they're a little bit more even and they have a little bit more diversity. And that's again just kind of emphasized here. On our sites we saw a total of 38 different floral species. At the rural sites we only had 27 of those represented, whereas at our urban sites we had 37 of those represented. So there was only one species that we found in our rural sites that we didn't see in our urban sites, but our urban sites in total had a lot more floral families, and that's, sorry, I think I said species, but that's plant families represented. So much higher number of families at our urban sites than our rural sites. Moving on to the bee diversity, there are likely around between 600 and 900 species of bees in Washington. We have 20 genera, so genera is the broader group. We have not identified all of the bees that we've collected down to species, but we, based on preliminary observations, we have gathered that there are likely dozens of different species. Bumblebees, honeybees, and sweat bees, which are smaller, either black or green bees, are the most common groups. But again, the overall diversity across all of our farms is pretty good. We have found that urbanization doesn't really play into an increased amount of diversity, as you can see here on the left. Looks like there's a trend going upward. It's not significant. So urbanization doesn't have a huge effect on the diversity of the bee communities. However, more urban spaces do tend to be a little bit more even. As I mentioned with the floral diversity as well, we see a little bit higher floral evenness, and we also see a little bit higher bee evenness in urban spaces. In terms of the bee health, we have found no really significant relationship with either honeybees or bumblebees and their body size compared with floral abundance. So this means that it doesn't really matter if there are a lot of flowers or just a few flowers available at the spaces. If we're finding the bees there, they seem to be getting what they need from the number of flowers that they have available to them. Again, there's a slight upward trend here, but it's definitely not significant, so we can't actually draw any conclusions from that. Similarly, floral diversity also doesn't really play into the overall body size of the bees. So again, we found that there really is no significant relationship between with bees having access to a lot of different types of flowers between allowing them to grow larger. We are still working on the lipid test, which should be done in the next few weeks, and that data will become available maybe next year's webinar. We're also working on some experiments. As Eli mentioned, we're doing habitat augmentation at some of our farms. We're also going to be doing some nutrition and disease studies to test whether any of these landscape effects are related to bee diseases and their ability to fight diseases with different nutrition profiles. So again, we have a lot of different people to thank. Of course, our funding sources, the lab support that we've had here from Washington State University, and all of our partners in our farming systems, all of our community partners, and more thanks. All of our research hosts, of course, our collaborators. We really couldn't do any of this work without the help of every single person and every single organization on these slides. So I think with that, we'll open it up to questions, and we've got some resource sections here at the back, so the webinar will be posted so you can have access to that. But yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. We are going to have about 30 minutes or so for questions. We got a lot of questions during Eli's section at the beginning of the webinar about the wisdom of putting bees near fast-moving highways. Is there any research regarding pollinator fatalities from cars, or are there hazards to drivers? There were a number of people that wondered how close they should be to highways, whether they should be more than 200 yards or so. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Alice, this is Bob. I can offer some insight on that. This is Bob Redmond. I'm a collaborator with Eli and Rachel on some of the work in the field, and also specifically have worked a little bit with the state of Washington on some roadside research. And the short answer is that there isn't a lot of data and a lot of studies on mortality from pollinators next to the roadsides. The research that there is, and I think that there are 3 significant studies that were cited by the Xerces Society in research review for the federal government in the 2015 pollinator report. And how they summarized it was, A, there is mortality, and I think it was about 10% of the resident bees would be subject to death. But if you think about it, if you're adding habitat and that increases the overall population, that might be acceptable. The second significant finding was that butterflies, since they not only forage nearby, but live in the habitat that's roadside, and because they don't fly as nimbly as bees, would have a significantly higher mortality rate. So that's definitely something to think about.
Okay, well, thanks, Bob. Okay, and this is a question for Eli. Please explain what bee beds are. Also, do the cavities or bamboo canes for bee houses ever need to be cleaned out?
Yeah, the question is about bee beds for ground nesting bees, and then also about cavities and whether or not they need to be cleaned. And I'll start with the cavities question. There is a considerable amount of evidence that indicates that if you don't clean out the cavities after every year or provide new nesting resources on an annual basis or on a regular basis, you can build up pest populations. And there's a considerable amount of literature out there, both through the Xerces Society and then also in some other publications that support that. And so if you are providing habitat for cavity nesting bees, then providing new resources on a regular basis is important. And then bee beds for ground nesting bees, 70% of all bee species live in the ground. They are largely understudied. We don't really know very much about ground nesting bees. And so what we're trying to do with the bee bed is provide a space where bees can nest in the ground and remain undisturbed, so that soil can be left and maintained for those ground nesting bees. And there really isn't a lot of literature on how to make bee beds more broadly for a lot of different bee species, but this has been done in some farming systems where providing ground nesting resources for bees has been shown to increase bee abundance in fields and pollination of crops like alfalfa.
Okay, yeah, we're getting a couple questions about ground nesting bee habitat. One person wanted to know if you could just talk more about that, to describe it and how you did it and whether it was successful. And a couple other people want to know how you control weeds in those areas, or if you disturb ground nesting bee habitat via cultivation.
The questions were, how did I do it, and then also how do you maintain it?
Yep.
And once again, we really don't know very much about building bee beds for ground nesting bees, and the literature is also very scant. And so we really are in the wild west of wild bees as far as providing habitat nesting bees goes. What I can tell you is what we did was we turned the soil and then we tilled it. So we plowed it and then we tilled it. And then I soilized that soil during the summer of last year to remove any weed seeds. And then this fall I kind of scuffed the surface to remove any weeds that didn't get taken out by the solarization treatment. And then we will be, tentatively, we will be maintaining these bee beds through the hand removal of weeds. So they are very big, and we plan to just kind of hand remove the weeds. And as far as disturbance goes, I know I kind of already addressed that in text, but once again, we don't really know much. If you could hoe that surface, if you were to use a scuffle hoe on that surface, what would happen if there were bees nesting there? Would that disturb them, and would they abandon those areas? I don't really know the answer to that question. But if we were to kind of extrapolate from what we know about ants, and ants are related to bees, and ants are seemingly kind of tenacious in that if you disturb their nest, oftentimes they will come back from that disturbance. And so I would think that bees would be similarly tenacious, but I don't really know, and I don't know if there really is any literature out there that would support whether or not you could use a scuffle hoe. I think there are some publications, once again, from the Xerces Society about different types of farming practices and how different types of bee groups might respond. So you might check the Farming for Bees publication by the Xerces Society.
Okay, yeah, we typed the link to the Xerces Society website in the chat box. Are they also a good place to learn about identification of different native bees?
I think the Xerces Society does have some information, particularly on bumblebees and bumblebee identification. I think more broadly speaking, there are some good books that came out recently kind of for the more broad general public. I believe one of the books is called Bees in Your Backyard or something to that extent, and it came out recently, and it's really wonderful. There are great pictures, and it has a lot of additional information on a wide suite of the different bee species found in North America. And bee identification is difficult. There are predicted to be somewhere around 4,000 different bee species in North America, and a lot of the identification of bees down to species happens under a microscope. So broadly speaking, you can generally pretty easily identify bees using some knowledge that you can gain through some internet resources to genus or to a morpho group fairly easily. But once you want to identify bees below the genus level, then you really have to get a microscope out in a lot of cases and start to count things like the antennal segments and look at different types of morphology on the face of the bee or different types of structures on the body of the bee to really start to figure out what species it is. So hopefully that wasn't too wordy. So species identification is tough, but I think there are a lot of resources out there if you want to learn about identifying bees more broadly and get a feeling for their morphology, broadly speaking.
Okay. Can you make any recommendations in terms of the proximity of bee beds and habitat strips to crop production areas?
I can talk a little bit about that, although I think Eli is probably maybe a little bit better to pop in. But essentially, depending on the size of the bees, they can fly different distances. So some of the smaller bodied bees will only fly 100 meters or so. So if you want to ensure that the smaller bees are getting into your crops or fields, then you'll want to plant the strips every 100 meters or so. Some of the larger bees can fly several kilometers. A lot of the bumblebees can fly up to 20 kilometers. So providing that space is going to kind of depend on the types of bees that you want to get into your fields.
Okay. If an organic farm already has established beehives, would establishing habitat that attracts or enhances wild pollinator populations interfere with honey from the managed hives?
Anytime you have an introduced species on your farm, such as managed honeybees, it may alter the relationships between the different organisms. That said, if you already have bees on your farm, establishing habitat for other bees is likely not going to have an observable sort of negative impact on your honeybees. Your honeybees are generally pretty competitive, but I would say that, like Eli mentioned, no change is going to be too small, and increasing the available resources for your native bees can actually make some of your honeybees a little bit more productive. There's been a few different papers that have shown that having a higher biodiversity of bees, so different types of bees, can actually cause a little bit of competition between the bees and increase their pollination services.
Okay. Let's see, we have a suggestion here from North Carolina, policy suggestion that you might adapt in Washington State, if not already. The few massive solar farms we have here include sheep that graze underneath the solar panels for grass mowing, so a policy could include grasses that might attract pollinators. Let's see. Do you have any thoughts on why there was a difference in bee diversity between certified organic farms and farms using organic methods?
Yeah, I'll jump in on this one. I think, it's important to note that that's a correlation that we found in our study, and that there might be a lot of other variables, and to look at that and say, oh, organic farming is better than farming systems that just practice organic methods, you have to really run that through kind of a more robust analysis to figure out if that truly is one of the more important variables. And so I think what's important to note is that organic farming systems, especially compared to, say conventional farming systems or farming systems that aren't bound by the rules that organic farmers are, those types of organic farming systems use practices that do appear to conserve abundant and diverse bee communities compared to the other types of farming systems, and that's more broadly supported in the literature too. And so, what's going on there? Well, there are a lot of different farming practices within organic farming systems, but a lot of those systems rely, on the reduction of pesticides and the increase in, more broadly, in the reliance on ecosystem services and the reduction of their externalities to the outside environment. And so I think it's an interesting correlation. There's definitely something to it, more broadly speaking, in the literature, and I think that's something that we're going to really have to get into over the next couple of years that this project is going on, to figure out, what exactly is it that these farming systems are doing that just increases the bee abundance like that. So sorry I don't have a more concrete answer, but broadly speaking, the literature does support that type of conclusion.
Okay. Some people would like to hear more about how you engaged citizen scientists and what kinds of data they collected.
Yeah, okay, so Rachel and I have been working really hard, and actually Bob has had a big part in this, and we started engaging the community in the Seattle area in 2013 and working with some different local nonprofits. One is Seattle Tilt and another one is Seattle Parks and Recreation. And with the help of Bob, and then also just by contacting those people through email, we were able to develop a relationship with Seattle Tilt and Seattle Parks and Recreation to have them host our citizen science classes, and they continue to do that. So Seattle Parks and Recreation and Seattle Tilt host those classes, and so far we've been hosting two different types of citizen science projects. One is to teach people broadly about bee biodiversity and how to monitor bee biodiversity in their farms and in their gardens. And so we've been having people take pictures of the different bee groups that they're finding in their farms and in their gardens and post that to our web. So we're collecting a measure of bee biodiversity. And then we're also looking at using cavity nesting habitat to monitor cavity nesting bees. So last winter and then again this year, we host a class, and then people come and learn about cavity nesting bees and their life cycle and their life histories, and then we give them cavity nesting bee habitat to take home and put up in their urban gardens, and then they monitor those cavity nesting habitat throughout the season, and then they actually send me the bees that end up in the habitat at the end of the year, so I can further look at the diversity of bees that we're finding in those nesting habitats. So the mainstay of this research has kind of just been engaging the community, and we're trying to find some interesting ways to do an analysis on these data that we're getting in. And more recently, we've been looking into pairing these data with the data that we've been collecting to look at the efficacy of citizen science as compared to researcher-driven science. And there's some body of literature out there that indicates that citizen scientists can collect really robust data. And so what we're doing is pairing those data now with our data that we've been collecting on farms and in urban gardens ourselves to see how exactly does that line up and what kind of differences are we seeing and what kind of similarities are we seeing. So I hope that kind of gets to that question a little bit.
Thank you. Let's see. This one might be for Rachel. It says flower diversity did not affect bee health. Did it affect bee diversity?
So we have seen a little bit of a trend there, and Eli actually I think can answer this one a little bit better. But it didn't have an effect just on the bumblebee body size. So we aren't measuring the overall body size or lipid content of every type of bee. We're looking at it specifically with bumblebees and honeybees right now. The project may at some point in the future expand to encompass all of the different bees, but bumblebees and honeybees are both real generalist bees, so they can feed on a lot of different types of plants, sort of like people can feed on a lot of different types of food. And so we were kind of just exploring if the types of flowers had much of an effect on their health. But as for diversity, Eli, do you want to tackle that part of this question?
So the question was about bee biodiversity and how it responds to flowers, or was it about urbanization? I'm sorry.
It was in response to floral diversity.
Oh, okay. Yeah, what we've found is that increasing floral diversity with increasing floral diversity, we do see a strong correlation to increasing bee biodiversity. And so I think I kind of mentioned this in one of my slides, that if you increase the biodiversity of plants in your cropping system, what we found is that with that increase, you see an increase in bee biodiversity, richness, the number of different bee groups, and then that's also substantiated more broadly in the literature too, that with increasing plant diversity, there's been a number of studies in field margins where they've installed pollinator buffer strips where they provide a bunch of different plant species that provide forage for bees. What you see is an increase in the bees that are being found in the fields and the amount of visits they are providing to plants. So our research definitely substantiates increasing bee biodiversity with plant diversity, and so hopefully that kind of gets at that question.
Has any work been done to identify pollinators needed for specific crops? In other words, when creating habitat, though diversity is important overall, if one wants to cater to bees that will actually increase your crops, is that information available somewhere?
I can take this one. So there is a lot of different information, and I think that probably the best place to look for that type of information would be through extension agencies. For example, there are definitely bees that are very well suited to pollinate specific crops. The Bees in Your Backyard book that Eli mentioned has a little bit of information about that, which is pretty cool. And I mentioned in a message, so I don't know if Alice can post the information, but the book is called The Bees in Your Backyard, and it's by Joseph S. Wilson and Olivia Messenger Carroll. So if nothing else, there's a verbal note about what that book is, and it's sitting on my desk here because I've been using it a lot lately. But it does have a little bit of information on the types of flowers or the families of plants that each bee might be specialized on. That said, having a wider range, just like Eli just mentioned, having a wider range of floral availability will increase the overall types of bees, and that increase the overall pollination services that you're getting, because again, the bees may be offering slightly different pollination services, and so having a lot of different bees will inevitably increase your overall pollination.
We have a question about bee health and what that actually is. It seems to be based on body size. Is it found that the larger the bee, the healthier it is, or do small bees die sooner?
Yeah, that's a great question. So right now, so far, all we've measured is body size. Um, as I mentioned, bees get all of their body sort of fat storage built on when they're a larva. So while they're developing, before they're adults, when you see bees feeding, um, you're seeing them sort of consuming fuel to fly around and collect pollen that they can feed to their offspring or their younger colony members. So right now we've only looked at nutrition, and there's been some studies that have shown that nutrition has an effect on the bees' immune system and their ability to fight off diseases. So in the future, this upcoming season and following years, we're going to be measuring whether that is the case for the bees and the diseases in our system. So we'll be doing a survey on bee diseases in our area, and then we'll be testing whether different nutrient availabilities and whether different body sizes has an effect on their ability to resist disease. So yeah, right now we've only looked at body size, but in the future we're going to be looking for relationships between body size and ability to resist pathogens.
Okay, well, we are running out of time, but I'd like to thank everyone for all those great questions. So thank you very much, Elias, Bridget, and Rachel, as well as Bob, especially Bob, for organizing the webinar, and to all of you for sharing this research with us. And we will look forward to future webinars to find out what you've learned in the coming year.